I'm John Lanius. Welcome to The Room. The Room gives you access to Geniecast top thought leaders, authors, entrepreneurs, business coaches, sports celebrities, and much more. Our guests will share ideas and concepts that you may use to better your organization and propel your teams. My guest today is Jack Uldrich, a leading futurist, author, and speaker. Jack assists organizations to gain the critical foresight they need to create successful futures. His work is based on the transformational principles of unlearning or freeing yourself from obsolete knowledge and assumptions. Hi, Jack. Welcome to The Room.
John, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So in our little pre-chat before we went live, we talked a little bit about unlearning. And for those who may not know the concept, I mean, they can get it from context, but for those who may not know the concept, let's just talk high level. What's the importance of unlearning?
Unlearning is absolutely critical to the future. The world is changing so fast. People can understand that, but one of the reasons why they miss the future is they can't let go of the things that made them successful in the past. They can't unlearn their business models, how their customers are changing, or even how their competitors are changing. So unlearning is absolutely critical to future success.
So that's a great place to start. And you identify as a global futurist, and we talked a little bit about Lao Tzu, who wrote the book The Tao Te Ching. So for you, what does it mean to be a global futurist, and how do books of wisdom like the Tao Te Ching play into modern times?
Really good question. So let me just explain to the audience what a futurist does. And let me give you an acronym. I call it the big AHA. And AHA as an acronym stands for awareness, humility, and action. We need to be aware of how the world is changing. We need humility to the idea that what served us well yesterday might not be sufficient moving forward. But at the end of the day, the final A stands for action. The only way to predict the future is to create it yourself. So as a futurist, I like to help organizations create their desired future.
So when I hear the word future and I think of, creating success, there's that quote that says, the path forward seems to go back. So let's go back to that moment when you said, I want to be a futurist. What was that defining moment?
That's a really good question. I will tell you, there was no one moment when I said, I want to become a futurist. I'll tell you just a little bit of my background. After college, I served as a naval intelligence officer for 3 years, and then I went to graduate school in strategic planning. Then I went to work in the Pentagon as a strategic planner. I did that for a few years, came back, headed up the Office of Strategic Planning for the state of Minnesota. But when I left that job, I wrote my first book, and it was on an emerging technology. And this was 15 years ago, and the technology was nanotechnology. And it was really hard for a lot of people, including speakers bureaus, to understand what I did. And one speakers bureau said to me, well, can we just call you a futurist? And I didn't know if there was actually a formal credentialing process to be called a futurist. So I did some research, and there is not. So I really just sort of slipped into the futurist moniker. That was my rough path to becoming a futurist.
Well, so you talked earlier a little bit about how unlearning is the future, and you describe yourself as a chief unlearning officer. So tell us more about the School of Unlearning.
Yeah, this won't work for all of the viewers, but I'm just going to ask all of your viewers this simple question. Regardless of where you live in the United States, what two colors are the yield sign in your home state? And I wanted to give that question some thought. And my guess is, based on past experience, close to 75% of you said, well, the yield sign is yellow or yellow and black. Well, you know what? That's wrong. The yield sign has been red and white since 1971. Somehow, many of us, when we were first learning to drive or the textbooks were outdated, we learned that yield signs were yellow and black. The problem is that old, crappy, outdated information has just stayed stuck in our head, even though most of us have been driving by these red and white signs for decades. It just hasn't sunk in. My point is, there are a lot of things that you learned about your business, your job, your industry, your customers, your business model, that yes, they were absolutely true yesterday. in today's accelerating world of advances in artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and blockchain and quantum computing and 3D printing and robotics. They no longer are. And this goes back to unlearning. I will tell you, the reason I speak so much about humility is, as a futurist, I've experienced a lot of it. I thought a lot of these trends were going to take place faster than they occurred. But at a different level, often I would be invited back to clients a second or third time, and I would say to them, well, what did you do with the information I presented you the first time? And when I was really honest with myself, the honest answer was not much. And I said to myself, that's not just their problem, that's my problem. I'm doing something wrong. And that's really where I came to this notion of unlearning. Before people can embrace the future, they've got to let go of what it is they think they know. And if I could just have one last point, I'd like to sum it up this way. Lots of times, very experienced business leaders will say, well, I have 25 or 30 years of experience in my industry. And sometimes that's true. Often, however, what people really have is 1 year of experience repeated 25 or 30 times. Something worked for them early in their career and they just kept doing it. And that was fine in yesterday's slow moving world. In tomorrow's exponentially changing world, it's no longer sufficient. Unlearning is absolutely critical.
Well, I think it's great that you use the example of the yield sign, because I was going through the experience as you were asking the question, and I couldn't remember what color the yield sign was. I was thinking it was yellow with like a white, border. But what I'm hearing and what you're saying is really beginning to, or at least getting to the whole point of beginner's mind. And everybody may not understand that concept, but when we get to beginner's mind, we get to a space of clarity. There's a Japanese word, shikaku, which means dead angle or eye of the hurricane. And where most people live in the chaos of the hurricane, where we begin to create power is by stepping into that center calm and moving that. So I'd like you to talk more about unlearning. So why is it important for us to unlearn before we go to seek and create innovation, for example?
Well, the reason it's so critical is one of the most important things that people need to learn is it is not their knowledge that holds the key to the future. It's actually what they don't yet know. And this is just human nature. Most of us spend our time focused on what we do know. But I'm here to tell you, our world is changing so fast on so many different fronts. I talked briefly about the technological advances, but it is changes in culture and demographics and politics. All of this is swirling around. And so in order to step into that calm, you actually have to focus on what you don't know. And John, if I could just give you a perfect example, and I actually offer this now as advice to business leaders. If you really want to think deeply about the future, if you have access to sort of a dark sky zone, or if you can get away from city lights, go out and just sit under the stars. Because there are two scientifically proven things that happen. One, suddenly you start focusing less on yourself. The I becomes smaller, just in the awe of the universe. But the other thing that happens is you actually begin focusing on how little you actually know. But rather than being scary, that's what's really exciting about the future. The only way business executives, anyone, can truly be free is to embrace uncertainty. That is simply a principle of the world. But so many people are focused on certainty that they'll latch onto it even when it is a false certainty. The people who are going to win in the future are going to, and this sounds counterintuitive, embrace their ignorance. And this really gets back to your point of the beginner's mind. I mean, in the expert's minds, there are few answers. In the beginner's mind, there are many. And there are so many opportunities in the future that the future is not something to be afraid of. It is something to be really excited about. And the way you do that is begin tapping into the beginner's mind.
I think it's really wonderful that you created the invitation to go out into nature and to look at the stars. When you were sharing that, I was thinking about a story that has always made an impact on me. When the lights went out in LA, and I mean the entire area was like dark. People were calling the police, thinking that they were being invaded because they didn't know what all the stars were and the Milky Way, etc. And I think for me, how I interpret what you're saying is that if we go out and begin to look at something that has us experience the experience of being small, it kind of forces us in some ways to begin to look differently at things or begin to ask different kinds of questions. So in looking at your work, what are some of the most important future trends that you're focused on right now that kind of jump from the points you're making?
Yeah, and if I forget, I want to get back to this point of questions first, but many of the trends that I am looking at, and people have to understand this, is the pandemic has accelerated the future and a lot of these technological trends. Just as an example, I mean, we already know remote work and online meetings, such as what we're doing right now, online education, telemedicine have all advanced. But one of the most extraordinary statistics of the last year was e-commerce, which was already a trend I was speaking about for years, and it had been growing rapidly. In the first 2 months of the pandemic, in April and May of 2020, it grew as much in those 2 months as it had in the last 10 years combined. That is remarkable. But now what the pandemic is accelerating is advances in robotic technology, satellite technology, 5G technology. And so of the ones that I am most excited about, let me just tell you, from my perspective, it's satellite technology. On a single day, in February, SpaceX, one of Elon Musk's other companies besides Tesla, launched 143 satellites in a single day. To understand how transformative this was, in all of 2013, just 8 years ago, the entire globe launched just 130. And so in a single day, a single company launched more. But they have plans to launch 1,500 by the end of this year. Those 1,500 satellites, what are they going to do? They're going to blanket the entire globe in high-speed internet access. This is a game changer. Of the almost 8 billion people on the planet, 3 billion still don't have access to the internet. But in the coming year, those 3 additional billion people are going to come online. And the opportunity for global growth and global trade and products and services could be absolutely mind-boggling. So if you're a business leader that has any exposure to international markets, you need to be thinking about how your world is going to change a lot quicker than you might otherwise expect. I talked about robotic advances. Just yesterday, Domino's, now down in Houston, is making pizza deliveries by drone technology. There's a startup in Seattle that is using robotics to zap weeds, which is going to transform the agricultural industry. So those are 2 trends that I would be paying attention to. If you're in the healthcare industry, the extraordinary advances in genomics and gene editing technology are going to rock our world. And this is not just healthcare. I mean, one of the things that's going to happen, and I think society, regardless of what business you're in, you need to be thinking about this. The incredible advances in genomics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, regenerative medicine, stem cell research, the possibility that you and I and everyone else listening could be living a lot longer than we expect. And I'm not just talking 85, I'm talking 90, 100, potentially even 110 or 120. These things sound implausible, but as a futurist, one of the things I've learned, you have to think about unthinkable things. And this goes back to having a beginner's mind. I think kids are really wonderful about envisioning different futures, but all of us have to do this. If I have any advice for business leaders, if your idea of the future sounds plausible, I'm telling you, it's going to happen, and there are a dozen people already working on it. If you actually want to be hip to the future and where it's going, if your idea doesn't sound a little crazy, you're off the mark. If it sounds a little crazy, a little implausible, you're a lot closer to where the future is going to take place, from my perspective.
My guest is Jack Uldrich, and we're talking about trends, and we're talking about, well, what I heard and what you said was consciousness. So maybe when we come back, we'll talk about being able to upload our consciousness with one of Elon Musk's other companies. So we'll be right back with more from Jack Uldrich discussing his new best-selling book, also Business as Unusual. Stay with us. You're watching The Room. We're back with Jack Uldrich, global futurist, speaker, and best-selling author. Now, before the break, we were talking a little bit about Tesla and satellites and a little bit of consciousness. So, Jack, I'm curious, are you someone who subscribes to that possibility that we're going to be able to upload our consciousness maybe in our lifetime to a computer?
I tell you, as a futurist, it is one of my responsibilities to keep a very, very open mind to the future. Here's what I would say to listeners is, by all means, be skeptical of everything I say about the future, everything you hear about the future. Do not, however, be cynical and say these things will never happen. Here's the difference. Skeptics, I think, because they keep an open mind, they keep asking questions. Cynics, because they think they know the answer, like that is never going to happen, and therefore I don't have to think about it. That's why they miss the future. And let me just give you a tangible example, and then I'll relate it back to consciousness. 5 years ago, I speak a lot to the ag industry. I was talking about the incredible advances in plant-based protein and artificial meat. Almost to an audience and to a man, I was universally dismissed. They're like, that is never going to happen. I can't imagine eating artificial meat or eating plant-based protein. Here's my point. Just because you can't imagine it doesn't mean that someone else can't, and that there aren't customers who might want those things. And so to go back to this idea of uploading consciousness, first, this whole issue of what is consciousness is a tough nut, and no one has cracked it yet. But Elon Musk's other company is called Neuralink, and it is the idea of putting computer chips in the brain, creating a brain neural interface so that our thoughts can be captured. That sounds absolutely crazy to a lot of people, but is it technologically impossible? No, it's not. It is incredibly difficult, and there might be barriers both technologically and ethically and morally that we have to consider, but it does not mean that it is not possible. So always keep an open mind to the future. That's my advice.
Well, Jack, I love how you're thinking, and you're using consciousness, which again, no one has, figured that out what that is yet. And maybe someone will soon, but I think that's fascinating. So given that we're obviously using our brains and using consciousness to create success for ourselves, let's shift to your new best-selling book, which is called Business as Unusual. So what does it mean to do business as unusual for you?
For me, it is, and what I do in the book is I walk you through 10 principles, and they all begin with the prefix "un." First, you have to expect the unexpected. Then you have to embrace uncertainty. You have to explore the unknown. You have to learn how to unlearn. You have to try unorthodox ideas. You have to question unquestionable assumptions, think about unthinkable things, and then imagine unimaginable futures. Oh, and also listen to unconventional voices. So there are a lot of principles, but most of them are based on counterintuitive ideas, and thus the prefix "un," and thus the title Business as Unusual.
So we all know the adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So what's your message to companies who have this mindset?
If you have that mindset, I am here to tell you the world is changing so quickly that you should actively go about exploring the idea of breaking some of your business models. If nothing else, I love this quote from Bertrand Russell. He said, every now and again, just hang a question mark on the end of your assumptions. Just because it's not broken today doesn't mean that it's not going to break tomorrow. I'm here to tell you one of the biggest challenges of the future is to understand how different technologies are going to converge. And just as a historical example, 12 years ago, if I was speaking to most people in the taxi industry, the idea of strangers giving strangers rides would have seemed ludicrous. And the response would have been, that's not going to happen. But it was the convergence of satellite technology, smartphone technology, and cloud computing that allowed Uber and Lyft to create a platform that allows strangers to give strangers rides. And now most of us utilize that technology. In the same way, the advances in artificial intelligence, edge computing, the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, robotics, 3D printers, all of these technologies are going to be converged by innovators to create new products, new services, and new business models. Just because your model worked yesterday doesn't mean it's going to work tomorrow, and you should actively begin, maybe not breaking it, but pushing its limits. And I guess if I have other advice, I grew up as a strategic planner, and I still believe in the value of looking out 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. But I'm here to tell you the future is changing so fast, so uncertain, that often strategic planning can lull people into a false sense of security. We somehow think the future is more plannable than it is. So what has to replace it? I would argue strategic experimentation. None of us fully know what is going to work in the future. So if you don't want to break your existing business model, which I understand, do at least begin experimenting, a pilot project, partner with someone different, someone out on the edge, try some different things. And if they show promise, then devote more resources and personnel to them and then allow them to grow. And if they don't succeed, don't worry. Failure is a powerful learning mechanism. Don't punish that failure. Say, what did we learn from it? And then apply it to the next experiment or pilot project.
Absolutely. Failure is key. More with Jack Uldrich and our 5 questions. After this break, you're watching The Room. Welcome back. We're talking with Jack Uldrich, a leading futurist, author, and speaker. Every week on The Room, we're going to ask our guests the same 5 questions. Now, Jack, as someone who looks at data collection to help provide a better future, we hope you'll appreciate how we're collecting insights on specific topics to provide our audience insights to cultivate a future we can all be proud of. Are you ready for your 5 questions?
I am.
All right, question number 1. What do you see as the biggest opportunities that businesses aren't taking advantage of in the world today?
I would say 2 things. First, I go back to the satellites. The opportunity for global growth is going to be absolutely extraordinary. The advances and the markets that are going to emerge in Africa, Indonesia, South America are going to be absolutely incredible. The second thing is be aware of advances in artificial intelligence. There's a wonderful quote from Gina Rometty, who's the former CEO of IBM. She said, artificial intelligence is going to transform 100% of industries, 100% of jobs, 100% of professions. And she is spot on. As a CEO, I would begin educating yourself about AI. Your CIO or your CTO, get him or her up to speed on it. And it is not too soon, if you're a slightly larger company, to begin actually having a chief artificial intelligence officer. It's going to be that transformative. I mean, it's as powerful as electricity and fire. It's going to be that transformative.
Such a great suggestion on that. Number 2, if you could have a conversation with one person from any time or anywhere, who would it be?
Years ago, as a futurist, I love to study history, and I've actually written 2 books on historical leadership. One was called Into the Unknown: Leadership Lessons of Lewis and Clark, but the other one was Soldier, Statesman, Peacemaker: The Leadership Lessons of George C. Marshall. From my perspective, George Marshall is the greatest American of the 20th century, and unfortunately, very few Americans know who he is. They might know the Marshall Plan, but they do not know the depth and breadth of his heroic career. He was instrumental in the First World War. He was chief of staff of the Army during the Second World War. I mean, he is the one who pulled Eisenhower and Patton from obscurity. And then he was the architect of the Marshall Plan. His ability to think long term was absolutely incredible. But what I also like about him was that he was absolutely a selfless leader. So selfless that unfortunately, most Americans don't know who he is, but I would argue it is the type of leader that we need today. So I would love to just have dinner with him just so I could pick his brain on how he thought, what he read. He spent 3 years in China, and I wouldn't be surprised if he read many of the books that we were quoting earlier. He was just an incredibly deep, thoughtful person, but who at the end of the day could make decisions that helped create, for the most part, a very peaceful and prosperous future for the world. So George Marshall would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about George. I mean, he is a hidden figure to many, and so thank you for that. I'm going to go do some research, like not a joke. Question number 3: what is one book every person in business should read, and why?
Nassim Talbot's The Black Swan, the high impact of low probability events. It was absolutely influential to me as a thinker, that we tend to think that the future is going to be created by many of the trends that I speak about. And that does play a role, but so often the world changes on events that people just don't think are going to happen. And this last year was the perfect example. A pandemic is a low probability, high impact event. And let me just tell you, in my 2012 book, Foresight 2020, in order to sort of introduce people to this idea of the black swan, and just so you know, up until 300 years ago, people assumed all swans were white. But it just takes the single observation of one black swan to render that 300 years of history obsolete. So that's where a black swan event comes from. And what I tried to do in the opening chapter of the book is just provide some possible black swans. And I've made claim, and I said, look, I'm not trying to predict the future, but in one of my scenarios, and I had it happening in 2016, and I said, I had a pandemic breaking out. It started in Mexico, but I did explain what was going to happen to the global supply chain and why businesses needed to at least spend a little bit of time preparing for this. And so my advice to business leaders: read that book and spend a little bit of time thinking about these seemingly unthinkable events, because they're more often than not what captures us by surprise. And I will tell you, the possibility that some of those satellites that I talked about sort of fly out of control, crash into one another, create this mess of space debris, which then cascades out and shuts down the global network, is a real possibility. If I was a business leader and I could think about what that means and how do we begin building some resilience into our system to prepare ourselves for these unthinkable things.
Question number 4: what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
This is really best piece. It's this, and I'm going to sum it up for you in 7 words. Give up on answers, stick with questions. And this pertains directly to the future. No one has answers to the future, but that does not absolve any of us of the responsibility of asking better questions. I think those individuals and those organizations that can ask better questions are going to be better positioned for the future. I mean, if you look at Black BlackBerry, Borders, Blockbuster, all of them had bright CEOs, C-suite teams, but they were answering the wrong question. If they'd spent a little bit more time, I think they would have come up with a better question. How was their business model changing? How was their customer changing? What were competitors doing? So stick with question, or give up on answers, stick with questions is the best advice I've ever been given.
That's great. And question number 5, and your final question: why is a conversation better than a lecture?
A conversation is better than a lecture because you are forced to learn, and it reminds you that you have something to learn from everyone. That, as I'm sure your grandfather said, that we were given one mouth and 2 ears just because we should spend more time listening. And I think that that's absolutely right. And let me, as a futurist, this is so critical, that we're so biased towards vision. We even call futurists and other people visionaries. What we need to do is become listenaries. We need to become better listeners. Listen to voices on the fringe. Listen to our customers. Listen to our frontline employees. We can become better listeners. We're going to be more aware of how the world is changing, what we need to do in order to play a positive role in that future.
Absolutely. How we listen is everything. I'd like to thank Jack Uldrich for being my guest on The Room today and sharing his thoughts and insights. So great. Jack, what would you like to leave us with today?
Let me leave you with this, and I end the book Business as Unusual. So I walk through 10 principles that begin with the prefix "un," but there's one that I don't mention, but I love this quote from George Bernard Shaw. He said, "The reasonable man or woman adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man or woman makes the world adapt to him or her. Therefore, all progress depends upon the unreasonable person." I just want to give all of the viewers permission to be a little bit unreasonable. Our world is changing so fast. But again, it's nothing to be afraid of, but give yourself a little permission to get into your discomfort zone and be a little bit unreasonable. If you do that, you're going to be well positioned for the future.
Well, Jack, thank you for being unreasonable today on The Room.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.
Join us next week when our guest will be author, keynote speaker, Judy Holler. Judy's mission is to empower audiences to manage their fear by arming them with the tools to make lasting change. She loves working with women, sales teams, direct sales organizations, entrepreneurs, and leaders, and we look forward to the conversation. I'm John Lanius. We'll see you next time on The Room.